body grows bigger.
Your mind's much smaller.
It's great to learn.
'Cause knowledge is power. It's Schoolhouse Rocky, the tip of the block of your favorite schoolhouse rock.
Oh, sorry. I'm AJ, and welcome back to Gen Z Garage. In this episode of Gen Z Garage, we're finally going to be removing the engine from my Pontiac Fiero by lifting the car off the subframe using these straps and this engine hoist. We're going to support the car with these chonkers here, and we're gonna roll the engine out using that rolly vehicle dolly thing. So let's get into it. In our last video, we prepared the engine bay by disconnecting absolutely every single thing that attached the engine to the rest of the car. This included the wiring harness, cables, cooling tubes, and anything else that was potentially large and bulky that might get in the way of the removal, like the alternator. In this episode, we will actually be separating the subframe from the rest of the car by lifting it high enough to slide the subframe out. Before we do this, let's recap last video's trivia question. In our last trivia, we asked you guys what you thought this was. This is called a fuel gauge vibrator. It's a rather silly name and it doesn't actually vibrate, but stabilizes the voltage coming from the fuel sending unit to the fuel gauge. This one is made by VDO and attaches to the back of the fuel gauge, which apparently my dad forgot to reinstall in our bus. Inside the fuel gauge stabilizer is something called a Zener diode, which allows voltage to reliably flow in a controlled manner by turning on and off the reading of the sending unit every 700 milliseconds. This ensures a more consistent reading. We had several answers almost immediately, but one person got the answer spot on. Congrats to 1985 Fiero GT. You win this week's trivia challenge. You could not have answered it more correctly. I plan to lift the car up by the rear bumper, but before I can do this, I'll need to remove the bumper cover. We start by removing the little black caps that cover the tail light hold-down screws. Although my dad has spares, I'll bag these to make sure I don't lose them. They don't make these anymore, and when they're gone, they're gone. With the caps removed, I begin removing the tail light screws. Like the plastic caps, these screws are also unique to the Fiero, so I'll bag them to keep them together. Next, I'll remove the tail lights, starting with the driver's side. I carefully wiggle the taillight out and begin disconnecting the connectors. These connectors must be turned counterclockwise to remove the socket from the housing. Although we'll address this later, you'll want to clean these connectors and replace any that are broken. They sell exact replacements on Rock Auto for each of these lights. Unfortunately, the driver's side taillight lens is cracked. This isn't something that can be repaired, so I'll eventually have to replace these. I'll keep them as spares though, since they don't make these anymore. And then I do the same for the passenger side. With the taillights removed, we now have access to the bumper grommets. But before we get to those, I'll remove the rear parking lights, which are also attached to the bumper. These screws are unique to the Pontiac brand, Corvettes, and some high-performance Chevys, so don't lose them. The socket and bulb twist out at a quarter turn, and it simply pulls out. With the corner light removed, it exposes the additional 7mm screws that hold the bumper to the upper rear quarter. But before I remove those, I'll first remove the 7mm screws that hold the inner fender to the bumper. There are several of these, and they are of different lengths. These screws are common GM screws, so don't worry if they are damaged or rusted, they can be replaced. I'll then remove the 7mm screws behind the corner parking light I removed earlier. Now that I've done this to the driver's side, I will repeat this process for the passenger side. I make sure to bag everything I take off. With both sides detached, we can begin removing the clips holding the top and bottom of the bumper. I'm going to start with the bottom since it just makes sense to do the top ones last. These clips can be reused, but I'd recommend buying new ones. They are fairly inexpensive and they'll provide a more secure grip to the bumper. You can typically buy a pack of 50 for under $20 shipped. Once the lower grommets are removed, I address the top grommets. There are 6 in total. There's no real order, so you can remove them in whatever order is easiest. As with everything else, I'll bag these in case I need to reuse them. but I'll probably buy new ones. With the grommets removed, I can now remove the bumper itself. Check first to make sure the bumper is loose around all attachment points, and then begin wiggling the bumper forward. You'll need to lift it up and over the metal bracket that supports it under the taillight. Be careful. If it gets hung up on either side, you'll want to stop what you're doing and free it. You don't want anything to break. Next, I remove the impact absorption honeycomb from the steel bumper so they're not damaged when I use the straps. The honeycomb is attached with thick blue grommets. Be careful. These grommets are really stuck in there and require a lot of force to remove.
A few moments later.
Alright, now I'm mad. I've had enough of this. This engine is coming out if it's the last thing I do. You're out of here. Next, I jack up the rear end of the Fiero and place a wheel dolly under the driver's side rear wheel. And then the passenger side. I can finally begin wrapping the straps around the bumper in preparation for lifting the motor. It looks like the upper bumper cover bracket will interfere, so I remove that as well. It's attached with a few screws, and I get it out of the way. I'm now ready to use the engine hoist, so I assemble it, starting with the legs. And then I've removed the engine leveler. Then lift the arm by hand to quickly raise it. And attach the straps. With a little tension added to the hoist, I can now begin detaching the cradle from the frame. At the top, the cradle is attached to the McPhearson struts on the suspension. I remove those starting with the driver's side, and then move to the passenger side. Next, we tackle the cradle bolts. I start with the forward cradle bolt. These can get rusty, so you may have to cut them out. I was lucky that this one came out fairly easily, but the passenger side took a bit more persuasion. I then move on to the rear cradle bolts. My dad helps by pulling the exhaust out a little bit to clear the cradle bolt so I can get my impact gun in there. And now, it's time. Okay. Almost. I forgot about the brake lines. I plan to install new stainless steel brake lines from the Fiero store, so I'll just go ahead and cut these with metal tin shears. Okay, where was I? Here we go! We remove the upper springs from the struts to provide for better clearance, and then begin pulling the cradle out from under the car. My boyfriend stops by to help me move the cradle assembly. Once we have it removed, we lower the car back down onto the big chonker jack stands. You go into the Pontiac, you're working at Pontiac, right? You're in the factory, and they tell you that because you're a new person, your first assignment is to chug like 13 cans of Campbell soup. And you're like, well, I don't understand why. And then they show you the inside of the car, and it's like, soup can. And that they just have every employee drink 10 things of soup per week just so they can get the cans. That's so funny.